Welcome back to Patristica. This is our second part in our series on data science and collaboration with a colleague who works in applied mathematics and statistics, K. Lance Lotharp. So we're coming back now to the topic of data set curation. And Marcus in the last episode talked quite a bit about how our team was really taking a new approach by having the first like data driven or text mining approach to doing a textual reconstruction, which makes the Marcionite texts are fascinating for many reasons, but the nature of the collaboration that has required and produced, I think, is particularly fascinating. So Lance mentioned, you mentioned being new to Greek, and as you came across these texts, you were initially using some of the data sets of the Marcionite Gospel that I had published with the Journal of Open Humanities Data and put in the Harvard Dataverse. But I was learning from you right away about some of the best practices of doing things like in a data set having comma separated values rather than separating with like periods, for instance, wrapping fields in quotation marks. I remember that was one of the first things you told me, like this would be a helpful thing in terms of keeping all the different data fields segmented correctly and ingesting those data into R. Fortunately, we were both people working in R. It's not that we don't work in Python, but I've been mainly working in R because I've been reading the work of computational linguists like Matthew Jockers, who was the person who did the Book of Mormon analysis and worked at Stanford and University of Washington. So I found R to be and I found R also to be very particularly helpful in collaborating with Bob and Vanessa Gorman, because Bob codes in R and has done some amazing work on syntactical analysis of Greek texts and author and voice identification and disambiguation using R. So if you're going to use Bob's toolkit, he was gracious enough to share that with me, so I've been able to do some of that analysis. Some of that stuff is not anything we've released to the public, but I've been doing analysis of like 2nd century Stoic authors using Bob's analysis and trying to see where we have authentic and inauthentic texts, for instance, of Epictetus. Also interested in Josephus on that front. But Lance, you had been working in R long before. You had been using it even in some of your coding projects with the Navy to do like staff analysis or something like that, as I recall. So can you tell us a little bit about your side of the collaboration when it came to R, and where you saw us following good practices, where you saw us maybe needing to improve to have better practices or best practices? And then we'll eventually get into data cleaning, but maybe you can tell us about your entree into Greek and then data cleaning in Greek and data management in post-classical Greek.
Right. So I started learning R on my wife's suggestion, actually. My wife is a social scientist, and so they use R very often in her field as well. And she said, well, if you're studying math, then maybe this would be a good skill for you to learn along the way. So I've been studying R, I've been using R, I should say, since 2017. And I've been looking for every opportunity that I could find to really build on my skills. And so working on this project has been a trial by fire, but I've learned so much in the process. And I would say that really it's been a learning experience for all of us, right? As far as coming up with best practices. I think that there was so much that we did as far as seeing how best should we disseminate the data sets between ourselves just as a research group, but then also what is the best way for us to put this out to the public, and what are some of the best ways that we can make it so that these data sets are not just things that we're working on, but that they're accessible to other researchers out there in the broad world. I'm not sure if you'd like me to speak any more on that, though.
Yeah, you're welcome to. Maybe just tell us about your thoughts about data management and data cleaning as it comes to this, and what was familiar to you already, and then what was new in terms of managing data sets of Greek. In terms of, I'm thinking of things like even as simple as what do we name a column, and how do we how do we segment, and what kinds of segmentation techniques do we use for text in a data set, and maybe how does scripture as a particular type of data set differ from other maybe types of data sets like the Federalist Papers?
Right, right. So I would say, like, one of the biggest things, and we'll probably talk about this later, as far as separating out Marcionite text from canonical text, the using the biblical text is great as far as having a reference for where you are in the text, because as you know, most texts that you use, they will not have a book, a chapter and verse associated with them. So it's almost as if by using this text, you have your own coordinate system, which is another way that you can just break down the text and really find some of the patterns that are there. So just having comma separated values helps out a lot. You could use period separated values too, but uh, I guess it's just more of a standard practice for you to use the comments there. And that was a learning process for us. There were many hours that I spent, especially with the toddler running around me, just we're piecing through these data sets and trying to say, okay, well, what works? What is easier for doing an analysis? What's a cleaner way to even just pull up a file? And if you would like to read through a specific Greek sentence for something in the Apostolos in this case, then what's the best approach to that? And so, like I said, I think that we've really hammered out a lot of the snags that were there, and the product that we have now is already building on something that was great to begin with.
Was one of the things I brought up with the group previous, and haven't mentioned it before yet, but was that when I was working with these data sets and coding in R, I was just writing scripts, usually like ridiculously long 1,000-line scripts in R, and I just was not an adept coder, and I don't know if I would be considered an adept coder now, but I learned a lot from Lance and his process of managing data cleaning, particularly because it's not only that building data sets one time. We would build a data set and then it goes over to Marcus. We do some statistical analysis. It gets refined. Then we use the refined version. So it became really an agile cycle of continuous improvement. And in that, we needed to run certain tasks on a routinized basis. And that's where Lance started developing a bunch of functions. And I just never used functions as part of my coding. I mean, I knew the concept of functions, but I just didn't have that background and training and skill set. So can you talk a little bit about your process when you were going through these data cleaning tasks and repetitive tasks of how you tried to put together and create new functions to manage this process? And had you created anything like that before? What made these functions different from functions that you had worked on before?
Well, I mean, the beautiful thing about functions is that they're by nature unique, right? And so you see a task that you would like to accomplish, ideally more than once. I even think that's a rule of thumb that they have for coding, period. If you need to do a function more than once, you probably should, and you don't have a function for it already, you should probably create a function to accomplish that goal. So the difference with this project was just seeing what the long-term potential was for it. And while this is still something that's a work in progress, knowing that the tools that we were using to work through Marcion's Apostolos there could be used for other projects in this realm down the line. And so if you have a bunch of functions, then you can just put that out onto the internet, and other researchers can pull down those functions and use them for their own research. So it goes beyond us here. That really, this is something that could benefit this academic community as a whole.
Yeah, that's right. That's really helpful. And what some of the things that we don't think about maybe in broader research, but it's not just that Greek is highly inflected, it's that its character set is particularly complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most English speaking researchers, when they're doing computational humanities research, particularly if it's English only texts and you're working on some of the popular packages in Python or R for natural language processing, there's going to be some nice built-in functions, but they're going to be generally in ASCII characters, right? Rather than UTF. So UTF being an international standard and a just much more complex encoding system, that might be a foreign concept. Like I don't think most New Testament scholars are thinking about UTF encoding when they're thinking about their research. But for us, that's crucial, right? Is this ASCII data? Is this UTF data? Is it UTF-8 data? Is it UTF-16 data? And so some of your functions were created and these are things for scholars like Marcus and Jack, that's like simple things like, is there an accent? if you have a capital Greek alpha, that can be an ASCII character. But if you have an alpha that's lowercase, uppercase, that has, you know, a squiggle underneath it, a grave accent, and acute accent, those are all different UTF endpoints or you know, encodings. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the functions you wrote to help encode the data as UTF and then normalize the UTF data.
Yep. So thankfully, the files we were working with, they mostly had the same encoding, which was UTF-16, but definitely just coming up with different versions of the functions just to make sure that this is essentially like debugging here. Just if this doesn't work, then try this other the function over here that would be applicable to that type of data. But then also taking note of when I actually ran into a problem with the code and feeding that up to Mark, just saying, okay, are there ways that we can actually go back into the files themselves and change these things around? Maybe there was a bug with how something was encoded. And I would say also outside of the world of data science and programming and everything, it was also good to look through, to perform the analysis on these data sets and see like, oh, well, you know, were there supposed to be 2 periods there? You know, maybe you might be missing a word here, or there's not a header. So just, you know, little dummy checks like that where all around your bases are covered.
Yeah, I found that to be enormously helpful in terms of data cleaning. Like I can go word by word through a text. You know, if Marcus had made revisions to the Greek text and then I'm looking at the data sets over here, it would take me hours if I were to go word by word through that. But by running some pretty basic functions to do things like create the lemmas, create the morphological tags. We also had functions that did things like handle special cases like elision, right? In Greek, if you have a one word like a preposition like kata in front of another word that starts with a vowel, then the vowel drops off the end of the preposition. So it just becomes like kat, you know, whatever the next word is, kat yesu or something. So you need, those are sort of special cases and you need to deal with those. Like if, you know, it comes to lemmatizing or counting up the number of lemmas or that sort of thing. So we built out special functions that handled elision. We built out special functions to handle things like accents being maybe different. And, you know, that sometimes those are very small things, but even just looking at the past reconstructions of Marcion's gospel, whether Harnack or Zahn put a grave or an acute accent can like throw off the whole analysis in terms of like unique words. So you need to normalize everything, right? You need to think of all the different permutations, all the different possibilities, and then make sure you're standardizing the data so you're always making these apples to apples comparisons. But I found it to be a huge time saver, especially on data cleaning. So just to be able to find exactly where in the text, like where am I missing a word? Where am I missing a morphological tag? Where is the morphological tag incorrect or incorrectly formed? So by running these standardized analysis, like how many lemmas do we have? How many morphological tags do we have? Make sure those numbers sync up. That's a great way. It was a great way of doing data cleaning. You also wrote some kind of higher end functions that helped us with our analysis. So one of these was a Marcionite data deduplication function. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. The basic challenge and promise, or challenge that we had in this project was we're seeing if we can build out sort of a separate Marcionite data profile and a canonical data profile, or multiple canonical data profiles. And in some ways, that's what we were doing. It's not just textual restoration; it's really profile building, right? What are the building blocks, or the ingredients, or the chemical compositions of each of these, the pre-canonical and the canonical profiles in all of these different ways. But you wrote a function that would remove the Marcionite data from the canonical data. So we would have sort of pure canonical data as part of building out that profile. Because
let me come in, because
was, go ahead, Marcus.
Because I think that step was a milestone for us, because when as a scholar you have your canonical New Testament in your hand, it's all canonical, and you assume it's canonical. But it's so interesting to see, can you withdraw from the canonical text all those texts which are the Marcionite part? So if we assume, I mean, if it's just an assumption, it might not be true. But if you assume the canonical is a revision of Marcion rather than the other way around, and we can play the game on both sides, yeah. We also can have the reverse direction of reworkings, yeah. But if you can extract from the canonical text all texts that we have been told are texts by Marcion, then we end up with a, yeah, now it's a Swiss cheese, if you like, yeah. Then we have indeed a fragmented canonical text of surplus text. So it's all the surplus text. It's not just the new letters like the pastoral letters or Hebrews. It is also the surplus chapters like Romans 15:16, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. But it is also within the text parts of verses which are stuck in between Romans 13, 1-7 and others, and fragments within a verse. So that is a data cleaning so that we get more and more to a pure, almost pure, canonical text, which is now the canonical text without the Marcionite part. And this was crucial, absolutely crucial, to then discover that the two profiled texts, so canonical without Marcion and Marcion's text, I mean, there are two words. Or can I say it in a different way?
That's great. Are you all still able to hear me? Okay, great. I don't know, but the sound cut out for me, but maybe that's just because we're turning our microphones on and off. But let's tell us a little bit about that to me was one of the, big aha moments of just being in admiration of your ability to write a function. And it was a very highly customized function. One might say an algorithm for this specific task. And I think it has a much broader applicability. And, we haven't published this yet. We've talked about publishing it as a package in R that would be available to other people. We hinted at it in a journal article that we submitted to the Journal of Open Humanities Data with our latest data sets. But I think there's much broader applicability here to any multi-stage textual composition. Anytime you have multiple major stages, you need to be able to disambiguate the stages, right? So what the function you created here, the algorithm you created here, it's by splitting out the Marcionite and the canonical data into two separate data sets. I think that was instrumental. So what was part of your process of creating that? What made it this a unique task? And then how did you build on some of that? What we were talking about before about how scriptures are sort of have their own their own coordinate system. That was part of your design of this function or this algorithm.
Right. So the coordinate system essentially was an integral part of the algorithm itself. So if you can think of, say, two example sentences where in canonical Romans it says the fox jumped over the fox jumped over the fence, right? And then in the Marcionite Romans it says over the fence for a specific line. Well, then this algorithm, it works by just taking the over the fence out of the canonical, the fox jumped over the fence, so that you're left with the fox jumped. And like just putting it succinctly, that's essentially how the algorithm works. And I mean,
may I just interrupt? Yeah. And then for me, the clue is, of course, that the fox jumps only in the canonical texts. In canonical gospels, the fox jumps. In canonical pastoral letters, and in the canonical parts of the 10 letters, only the fox jumps there, and he never jumps in the Marcionite text. That's the great thing, yeah.
Exactly, and I think another huge part that goes along with that, because some people might ask, well, if you have now a canonical version of this text that's like Swiss cheese with sentence fragments all over the places, then how do you make anything meaningful from that? And that's digging deeper into the analysis itself, where we're not necessarily at least as far as the analysis that I am doing as in the role of data scientist, I'm not looking as much at sentences or exclusively at sentences. You can also pull out different features from a text where it's just specific words that we're looking at. So in some cases, in some analyses, that could be, we want to see the words that are just functional, words like English, the, of, and things like that, that you would expect a writer to have in any text, right? And the usage of these terms can give a lot more information about who the writer is themselves, because these are words that you would use without thinking about them, right? But then on the other side of that, there's also a hapax legomena, and so these are words that are very, very specific to a certain context. Like you wouldn't expect quasar to show up in a text that's about brain surgery, right? And so if you were to see the word quasar, you can guess, well, this might be a text that deals with astronomy, with space travel of some sort, right? And that's just another way that we can identify writers, and we can identify texts themselves.
That's great. And just to get a little bit more into the brilliance of the algorithm you wrote, it uses the coordinate system of the scriptures, the chapters, verses, book, chapter, verse as kind of its starting. It's almost like if you're going down a street and you're going house to house, you're almost going word by word, kind of house by house, and you're doing a location match, but also a word match function. And so, like, if the two houses don't align, if the address doesn't align with that house, you skip it. It moves forward to the next one, but any matches. But it picks up pretty well. Like in a lot of Greek sentences, you have multiple ands, right? Kai is a very frequently occurring word. So you might have Kai 2, 3, 4, 5 times, but your algorithm still does a nice job of not just removing all the Kais or removing just the first Kai, but if there are 3 Kais in the pre-canonical and there are 4 Kais in the canonical, it will remove just the 3, and it'll leave the extra 1. So the accuracy of it, I found to be pretty amazing when you think about it. When you do, and we could run it and then do word counts and see, okay, this is how many Marcionite words, this is how many canonical words, add them all up, you get the total canonical. The numbers synced up pretty well. So the algorithm I found to be in practice really highly accurate. I don't know if it's like 99.9%, but maybe like 97, 98% accurate in terms of like running a very highly, like very specifically scoped deduplication or disambiguation function. So I was very impressed by the algorithm you wrote, for that task. And like Marcus said, it's been instrumental in helping us build out these profiles. And it was in running that. Maybe, I don't know if we're to our 3rd episode yet. Maybe we should come up to our 3rd episode. But Jack, would you like to chime in here to conclude this episode?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 things that stuck out for me. I spent a lot of time with the data sets, checking over them. And that is, I think, to use an analogy, the washing of the shirts and the shining of the boots before that you 2 go out and play at the Super Bowl. And I think that the meticulous nature of this type of research should not go unappreciated, that it's not just a case of rocking up, having a go, and then seeing what comes out. It's quite painstaking, and it had sort of the level of accuracy, to my mind, of like thoracic heart surgery. I was concentrating constantly, even in the little things, to try and not make a mistake, because that could skew a lot of what could happen next. And just to reiterate, I mean, we use the fox as an example, jumping over, but these small words are things that I found particularly in Ignatius and also are borne out again in the Pauline stuff. Words like into and prepositions like katar or whatever. These things are so indicative of one's style and ability to write with a certain flourish or have rhetorical phrases, etc. And these are also things that are both not easily replicated or easily omitted. And we've spoken on this before, that even if they were to be omitted, they're such benign, irrelevant omissions. Why remove the word against or according to? Like, this is so mad to believe that people have gone through this. Again, they would need the surgical precision to do so. And I think that that's, again, something that was highlighted so clearly in the analysis that you did, is that, these small words, as well as these bigger themes, are somehow disappearing from a text. And then one has to make that decision of, do you think someone has removed a single word that's there, as Marcus said, 600 times? Or do you think someone might have added it in sections that sort of agree with their own agenda or theology? And to my mind, the answer is obvious.
Let me give you.
Go ahead, Marcus. Sorry.
Yeah, let me just give you one example because I've just opened my concordance here. It's just a simple one, but a nice one. So we have the word hagiazo, so to sanctify, and we find it 28 times in the canonical New Testament. Now, interestingly, it only appears once in Luke. And it appears in a text which is well testified and witnessed for Marcion's gospel, namely, it's the Lord's Prayer. Your name be sanctified. But this is exactly the small passage which is missing, according to Tertullian. So the single occurrence of hagiazo in Luke is only in a verse which we find in canonical Luke, not in Marcion's text. Now, interestingly, when you then look, where does sanctify, hagiazein, occurs elsewhere in the canonical New Testament, you will find it also only occasionally in the other Gospels. So we have only two occasions, or three occasions, two verses with three occasions in Matthew. We don't have it in Mark at all. And in John, where you think sanctifying must be something core to John, no. It is only in John 3 times, again, only in two, 3 verses. And then, interestingly, it appears in Romans. But in Romans, it only appears in the chapter which we are knowing that it is missing in Marcion's Romans. So it's again in Romans 15. It's in the opening of 1 Corinthians where Tertullian says it's missing there. So we have it 2 times more in 1 Corinthians, always in passages that Tertullian misses out for Marcion. And then it comes again, particularly in Ephesians. And Ephesians is so well attested for Marcion. Almost most of the verses are present, but not this one. It's in Ephesians 5:26, missing again in Marcion. And even more important, it is a term which turns up again and again in the pastoral letters. So in those letters, which are canonically added around the time of Irenaeus to the canonical 10 letters of Paul. So we find it in 1 Timothy, we find it in 2 Timothy, and we find it, a number of times in Hebrews. We find it also, and this is another key factor, we find it in the sub-collection, which again only is added to the canonical collection in the times of Irenaeus. It is found in Acts twice. It is found in the Catholic letters several times. You find it in Jude. You find it in 1 Peter. And you find it in the last text that's been added to the collection in Revelation. So what I'm saying here is this profile alone, of this word alone, gives us a key term, which is, and I think the next level we want to do, and we need to do, is to disambiguate first canonical reduction and second canonical reduction. If this term had been part of the first canonical reduction, we could assume it is more widespread in the canonical text that we have extracted. If we can do, as a next disambiguation, extract texts which we can see, like here, a term which appears so often only in those texts which are added around the time of Irenaeus. So in the second canonical redaction, we can disambiguate whether, for example, the Lord's Prayer has already been in the earlier redaction of the canonical redaction, or whether Luke 11:2, which it appears now, is only being added and redacted into the text once these texts like the pastoral letters and Acts were added to the text. So what scholarship, I think, will have as a tool with these kind of functions that we are talking about is that we can learn how in steps the canonical text has developed. We're not just interested in Marcion. Marcion is one step in development. What we can say is that Marcion has a certain reductional level that we can then add the first canonical reduction, and then a second canonical reduction. And I think in the future, but we are just in the beginning, we can also work backwards, because we know in the meantime, through our work, that Marcion was not the origin of everything. People sometimes have thought I'm obsessed by aliens, and particularly by Marcion. That's not my interest. It's just an entrance door, right? And we know by now that Marcion was making use of two earlier collection of Paul's letters, a 3-letter collection and a 7-letter collection, to disambiguate out of the Marcionite text again what is earlier, what could have been the text before. And just likewise, when Marcion was using 2 texts for Paul, he potentially was also using 1 or 2 collections for his gospel, to disambiguate between the text that we have witnessed for him, the first witness text ever. We don't have Q witnessed, we don't have anything else witnessed prior to Marcion. But here we have something. And by working through stages, we might come a bit closer to what was going on before the text that we have in Marcion. So I think there are worlds out there for future New Testament research. Thousands of people can write PhDs on this. This is not yet touched.
Yeah, I think that's great, and that's a great opening into that we're breaking new ground here. But the idea of doing multi-stage analysis of texts or stratification, but doing stratification in a scientific way. It's not just subjectivity, but it's profile building, it's data pattern tagging, but doing that bidirectionally. That's an interesting thing. We haven't really thought about that yet as a group. We really just thought about two stages.
For patristics. I mean, this is just one part of patristic text, which is the New Testament. But we have Ignatius, we have Barnabas, we have the Didache. I mean, we have, and then outside of the Christian world, I mean, this is a toolbox, right, that we're going to develop, which has so many applications.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
absolutely.
Maybe we could go back to Lanson. You not only wrote that function algorithm that helped deduplicate and separate out the Marcionite and the canonical data, but one of the early analysis you did, and we decided not to get too technical here, but it was principal components analysis. But you were using that deduplicated data to run the principal components analysis. Maybe you could talk a little bit about PCA and how it helped us identify different stages or different profiles in this data, and what you saw in some of those early principal components analysis.
Right. So just in super layman's terms, principal component analysis is a way of taking a large data set and then breaking it up into different clusters that are there. And so in this case, we were looking at information dealing with the lexical features of the text, and we're sorting them by the books from which they derived, and then you just came up with the different clusters that were there. So off the top of my head, I'm blanking on what the results were from looking at the non-Marcionite canonical text that's there, but the way that this analysis has been done before on the canonical letters of Paul. So if we just look at the 10-letter connection, it aligns with exactly what scholars have thought for a long time, where you have these 7 genuine, quote-unquote genuine letters of Paul. And I mean, everyone here, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But it's Ephesians and Colossians are on their own, and then I want to say it was
Second Thessalonians was also clustering away from the rest of them, and then Philemon always was in its own little universe whenever we ran a PCA. Yeah,
right. And so, but you can see it there because these are things that just any expert who's reading the text, it's almost like you're reading letters from a friend of yours compared to a complete stranger. You have an idea of what your friend's voice sounds like when they're writing, when they're speaking and everything, and you can tell just from reading their words if there's something off, if there's something different that's there. And so here we can really create an abstraction of that process using PCA and then come up with different clusters associated with that. And there are many different ways that we could do cluster analysis too, but that is one way that was the method that we used for early analysis here and exploration of the data sets.
That's part, as I recall, part of what reinforced for Marcus that there was a two-stage or two-source reality behind the Marcionite collection, that we didn't just have one Marcionite apostolos. We were seeing the separation out of two distinct clusters in terms of lexicography, but also in terms of this PCA. And PCA is not really trying to look at all the data. It's really just trying to look at what is the most significant data, what data explains most of the differences between different texts or between different clusters. And it often was just the most highly occurring, the most frequently occurring function words. Right. Often were the ones in the PCA that made the most difference. So it's not the things that, if you're looking at it from a human perspective and trying to look for a distinctive vocabulary, it's not even necessarily that as much as just what are the most repetitive habits that a given text has or a different author has in the text. So that the PCA was a useful way. Again, we're not trying to produce our plots here in this particular episode, but it was an important part of our behind the scenes process. We have decided to wrap up this episode. I think we're going to record one more, maybe two more, but we're going to wrap up the episode now, and we'll look forward to joining you all for the next episode.